The Sony A95K measured slightly dimmer than the Samsung S95B, which uses the same QD OLED panel, even though the Sony is equipped with an extra heat dissipation layer, but there's a very good reason for it. This is a looping HDR footage from the Meridio 7G signal generator, whose unchanged APL and big red stop sign would normally cause most consumer OLED TVs to auto-dim over time. When I began playing the footage, you can see that both the Sony A95K and the Samsung S95B started off similarly bright. However, after about 5 minutes, the picture on the Samsung QD OLED had obviously become darker, whereas the Sony A95K still maintained its original brightness. 7 minutes in, and the Samsung had continued to dim down its brightness, so much so that you couldn't even see the trees in the background anymore. To explain, this is a protective mechanism implemented on most OLED TVs to reduce the risk of image retention and OLED burn-in, and it seems that by installing a heatsink and adopting a more conservative approach in terms of screen brightness, Sony can afford to forego this auto-dimming protection, allowing the Bravia A95K to deliver a more consistent viewing experience that's not disrupted by auto-dimming. Of course, you can disable the auto-dimming on LG and Samsung OLED TVs by making some changes in the service menu, but this action in itself would void the warranty, since you're essentially bypassing the pre-programmed protective algorithm. Now, consumer tampering of service menu on LG and Samsung OLED televisions is seldom checked by technicians, and so the warranty invalidation is rarely enforced. But you don't need to go to such lengths and take such risk on the Bravia A95K Master Series OLED, at least on the latest firmware when I tested the TV in June 2022. Just like what we observed on most Sony OLED TVs, the Japanese manufacturer has designed the Near Black Gamma on the Bravia A95K to track brighter than reference, causing dark scenes to appear slightly washed out, although our review sample did better than the A90J retail unit we purchased last year in this respect. Unfortunately, the brighter Near Black Gamma couldn't be completely dialed out through calibration, since Sony's 20-point white balance adjustments only went down to 4.6% video stimulus, so even after calibrating the lowest 20-point control manually, one particular region just above black would still go from too bright to too dark too quickly, creating a noticeable jump in near black gradients. One possible workaround is to decrease the black level setting to improve black depth, but this is also problematic for two reasons. One, we are basically just shifting the issue from one region to another, as you can see not only from this quantization test pattern, but also in this heavily compressed dark sequence from Game of Thrones, where additional posterization would be brought to the fore despite the welcome improvement in image depth. 2. Due to how Sony has designed its televisions, any adjustment to the black level setting in SDR would carry over to HDR on the same input, affecting the peak brightness and EOTF tracking however slightly, which will require further correction down the line. Given that the Samsung S95B QD OLED features a near black gamma which tracks darker than reference, it seems that the most accurate near black luminance tracking in 2022 still belongs to WRGB OLED televisions, such as the LG C2 and G2, and likely the Panasonic LZ series. One area where QD OLED definitely has the upper hand over WRGB OLED is near black chrominance overshoot, or lack thereof. The Sony A95K presented this torture test sequence from Monster Hunter in a more stable manner, with smoother gradients and less flickering than on last year's A90J. Compared to the Samsung S95B, the Sony A95K did not manifest as much black smearing artifacts on this near black test pattern developed by Stacy Spears of Spears and Mansell fame, perhaps mitigated by an increase in the strength of temporal dithering below a certain threshold just above black. SDR color accuracy was very good after calibration using a Colorimetry Research CR100M profile to a CR250RH spectroradiometer, with an average delta error of below 1 on this challenging color checker SG chart where 140 patches were measured, and no inaccuracies exceeding the humanly perceptible threshold of delta error 3 for moving video content, allowing general colors including skin tones to be faithfully reproduced according to the original creative intent. Like all of Sony's 120Hz televisions we've reviewed so far, the Bravia A95K correctly performed 4:4 pull-down even with motion flow disabled, refreshing at 96Hz to present slow panning shots in 24 frames per second movies accurately without telecinic judder. Due to OLED's near instantaneous pixel response time, some viewers may find the mild stutter inherent in 24p films more apparent compared to LED LCD televisions whose increased motion blur would ironically mask the 24p stutter. If you are sensitive to this issue, you can set the smoothness control on the A95K to 1, which will apply a small dose of motion interpolation to smooth out the stutter without incurring too much soap opera effect or SOE. And the good news is that Sony's motion flow algorithm tends to introduce less interpolation artifacts, such as sparklies during complex sequences, or frame skipping in slow panning shots, or microstutter during head movements and hand gestures than motion-compensated frame interpolation from other TV manufacturers. To increase motion resolution from the sample and hold baseline of 300 lines to the traditional OLED ceiling of 650 lines, a smoothness value of at least 2 was required, and motion resolution could be boosted further to 1080 lines by setting clearness to high, which would activate black frame insertion or BFI. For 24 FPS content, the BFI on the Sony A95K refreshed at 48Hz to avoid introducing telecinic judder, but there's still a bit too much flicker to our eyes, and the same applied to 50Hz. Furthermore, in HDR mode, engaging BFI would halve the peak brightness with a corresponding darkening of the PQ UHF tracking, which is the final nail in the coffin for us as far as BFI is concerned on the A95K. Just like on last year's Sony OLEDs, a combination of motion flow custom and film mode high was necessary to recover 24p cadence from the internal streaming apps that operate at 60Hz. So don't be tempted to change either setting from default when watching streaming apps such as Netflix, or you will start seeing telecinic judder in slow panning shots. That said, film mode high would cause intermittent stutter in broadcast programs containing mixed edits, which could be eradicated by switching to the less aggressive film mode low setting. Since Sony televisions including the Bravia A95K allow for independent picture settings per input, owners should be able to dial in the correct settings for different types of content. Upscaling was very good, with high-definition broadcast and even low bitrate programs, such as this grubby recording from ITV3 in standard definition, generally coming across as sharp and detailed as they could be. However, due to a very small dose of dynamic sharpening even with reality creation disabled and sharpness left at its neutral setting of 50, some scenes in 1080p Blu-rays which already contain densely packed detail would appear a touch over-processed. Also, because of some noise and fizziness along high contrast edges on this SMPTE RP133 test card in 576i, not to mention the presence of some jaggies along the circle and bouncing bars on this video mode deinterlacing test pattern from the HQV benchmark disc, some diagonal lines would betray more aliasing than LG and Samsung OLEDs when paused up close. But this shouldn't be a problem when watching moving video content from a normal viewing distance, and may even increase the perceived sharpness of the picture on screen. With film mode enabled, the Sony A95K correctly detected and processed 3.2 and 2.2 cadences to suppress jaggies and line twitter in film-based interlaced material. The smooth gradation decontouring filter can be used to reduce in-content posterization, especially in bit-starved content. But don't go too high or you will start losing fine detail, culminating in a blur filter effect. Our preference is smooth gradation low for less than pristine content. Courtesy of its QD OLED panel sourced from Samsung Display, our 55-inch Sony A95K review unit boasted class-leading screen uniformity, exhibiting no bending, dirty screen effect or color tinting on full-field gray slides, not even from an angle, unlike recent deuterium-based WRGB OLED TVs which manifest an obvious pink tint off-axis. There's no faint horizontal lines, or what we call the Venetian blind effect in very bright HDR elements on screen either. That uniformity on our review sample seemed to be even cleaner than our Samsung S95B retail unit, which already outperformed any WRGB OLED TV we've tested so far. For HDR, peak brightness measured 940 nits on our review sample after calibration to D65 white point, and just under 200 nits full fill, allowing the Sony A95K to deliver more impactful HDR and retain more bright highlight detail than last year's Bravia A90J OLED, whose tone mapping algorithm favored preserving APL over highlight detail. Talking about calibration, I would like to tell you about the pre-calibration service offered by UK electrical retailer Crampton & Moore, who have kindly sponsored this video. I've personally trained their calibrator David Corner to my very own high standards. For an extra fee, he will run in a television you buy from them, calibrate it and deliver it to you after having the calibration approved by me. We've been providing this service for more than 1 year, and customer feedback has been excellent. So please give Cranmer More a call if you wish to buy a pre-calibrated TV, or even any new TV at a competitive price with excellent customer service. Thanks again for your support. Okay, powered by quantum dot technology as evidenced by the beautifully distinct red, green, and blue spectral waveforms, the Sony A95K covered nearly 100% of DCI-P3 color gamut in UV terms, as well as more than 90% of Rec 2020. Moreover, the lack of white subpixels on the A95K's QD OLED panel resulted in high color luminance that surpassed any WRGB OLED TV to date, including the Bravia A90J, whose subpixel boosting technique impressed us so much last year. Of course, the vast majority of HDR scenes will look very similar on a WRGB OLED TV, simply because most HDR movies are not graded so aggressively to push the boundaries. However, when the rare scene calls for it, QD OLED TVs such as the Sony A95K will be able to render brightly saturated colors in a more faithful manner than WRGB OLEDs, which have to choose to either darken the color while maintaining saturation or preserve luminance at the expense of saturation, leading to bright colors looking washed out, or what we call the white subpixel dilution effect. In terms of outright HDR impact in the most accurate picture modes, the Samsung S95B remained ahead by a whisker owing to slightly higher peak brightness and generally more relaxed ABL. But I've explained why Sony opted for a more conservative approach in the intro of this video. The Samsung S95B doesn't support Dolby Vision, whereas the Sony A95K does, which we've measured to track the ST2084 PQ EOTF standard accurately in the Dolby Vision Dark Picture preset. Now, some quarters have questioned the usefulness of Dolby Vision, because the Dolby Vision presentation in certain shows would look darker than HDR10. But these people probably don't understand how the Dolby Vision trim pass process actually works to better preserve creative intent when down mapping from mastering monitors to consumer displays. Otherwise, the Bravia A95K featured excellent native 10-bit gradation as we've come to expect from high-end Sony televisions, with no additional polarization visible in the skies of the Martian, even with smooth gradation disabled. With game mode engaged, input lag on the Sony A95K measured 16 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, halving to 8 milliseconds at 120 frames per second, which should be quick enough to satisfy all but the most hardcore gamers. Just like last year's Sony Bravia XR TVs, the A95K uses the same MediaTek MT5895 chipset, so there's no change in its HDMI 2.1 configuration, with 2 out of 4 HDMI inputs provided being HDMI 2.1, of which one is the eARC port. The HDMI 2.1 bandwidth is spec'd at 48 gigabits per second, but FRL signaling and Dolby Vision remain mutually exclusive, so you won't be able to play games in 4K 120Hz Dolby Vision from the Xbox Series X. Not that you would want to play games in Dolby Vision on any Sony television including the A95K anyway, since the Japanese brand hasn't bothered offering a Dolby Vision game mode to cut down the frustratingly high input lag in all other non-game Dolby Vision picture presets. Unlike LG and Samsung OLEDs, the Sony A95K doesn't automatically switch on HDMI 2.1 support when you hook up a next-gen console such as the PS5 or the Xbox Series X, so you will have to manually go into the HDMI signal format submenu and engage Enhanced Format or Enhanced Format VRR for the HDMI port to which your HDMI 2.1 source device is connected. Note that engaging VRR mode on the TV will lock the Bravia A95K into game mode with a somewhat higher input lag. Compared to game mode implementations from rival manufacturers, Sony's game mode retains excellent upscaling and gradation, and you can even deploy the smooth gradation decontouring filter to smooth out in-game posterization, although because the more aggressive settings would also scrub away some fine detail, leading to an overly filtered, artificial presentation, we generally wouldn't go higher than the smooth gradation low setting. VRR implementation including for G-Sync from an NVIDIA RTX 3090 graphics card was buttery smooth without noticeable tearing or frame drops in the NVIDIA Pendulum app, as long as you stay within the VRR range of 48Hz to 120Hz, possibly down to 24Hz with LFC or low frame rate compensation. But since the Sony A95K is still an OLED display at the end of the day, some VRR flicker was inevitable in some of the more sedate scenes and static menus. Onto the subject of HDRG, which is not officially supported by any Sony TV, including the Bravia A95K. Upon interfacing with the Bravia A95K in HDR for the first time, the PS5 would draw upon Sony's Auto HDR tone mapping feature to auto-populate the Adjust HDR values, resulting in 22 clicks for both maximum full-frame tone map luminance and maximum tone map luminance, which corresponds to around 2700 nits, as well as 2 clicks up for minimum tone map luminance, which means that the black floor in HDRG compliant games will not be 0 candelas per square meter black. A max TML and max FFTML of 2700 nits would still blow out some specular highlight detail in HDRG games despite Sony's gradation-preferred dynamic tone mapping, so it's less than ideal. Last year's workaround of turning off HDR tone mapping to simulate HDRG unfortunately was useless on the Sony A95K, since disabling HDR tone mapping on our review sample led to an overly bright PQ EOTF tracking. So when we went through the Adjust HDR procedure with HDR tone mapping off, the A95K hard clipped at 11 clicks for both maximum full-frame tone map luminance and maximum tone map luminance, equating to roughly 550 nits, which is well below the actual peak brightness of the QD OLED TV, contributing to an underwhelming HDR presentation in HDRG compliant games. Based on our testing, we recommend setting the first and second screens in the Adjust HDR calibration on the PS5 to 15 clicks, which targets almost 1000 nits, then letting Sony's gradation-preferred dynamic tone mapping do its own thing for the best results on the A95K. Because the TV is still performing tone mapping on top of the tone map output in HDRG games, the HDR presentation won't be as impactful and accurate as that delivered by LG OLEDs with well-implemented HDRG. But compared to the Samsung S95B, the Sony A95K's more accurate PQ EOTF tracking and well-judged roll-off in game mode allowed it to preserve slightly more bright highlight detail in HDRG compliant games. Given what happened with the Sony X900H LED LCD back in 2020, we checked for 4K 120Hz resolution and verified that the Bravia A95K successfully passed full 4K 120Hz resolution with HDR and VRR engaged, thanks to the presence of a co-processor in addition to the MediaTek MT5895 SoC. However, the Sony A95K did not resolve 444 chroma as cleanly as PC mode on LG and Samsung OLED televisions, perhaps due to either the MediaTek HDMI 2.1 chipset or the co-processor, or both. Otherwise, the Sony A95K carries two unique traits which are common to all QD OLED displays we've reviewed to date. 1. The red, green, and blue subpixels are arranged in a triangular configuration, instead of the more traditional RGB stripe layout, which may lead to color fringing on high-contrast edges, most notably PC text at native resolution. However, unless you are using the TV as a PC monitor up close, we don't think it is a problem for most people from a normal viewing distance. 2. Similar to the Samsung S95B, the Sony A95K suppressed reflections extremely well, but the screen would turn grey with a maroon tint, particularly when hit by direct light, due to the lack of a polarizer in the QD OLED panel. From our experience, your eyes shouldn't pick up the grey or blacks when there's enough bright content on screen. But please bear in mind that when the television is off, the screen won't look as black as the bezel, depending on the angle at which light hits the screen. The monolithic design of the Sony A95K Master Series OLED is unlike any other 2022 OLED TV on the market, with only the screen visible from the front to create an immersive viewing experience. To achieve this sort of minimalistic design, a very heavy stand has to be placed behind the TV to act as a counterweight, and for stability reasons, the screen has to lean back slightly at a 3-degree angle, which we swiftly got used to after a while. There's also the option of putting the stand at the front of the screen, but due to its bulk, we suspect that most people who want to place the Sony A95K flush against the wall will probably just wall mount the TV using a VESA-compatible mounting holes. Hiding the onboard speakers is also integral to the monolithic slab design, and the Bravia A95K is equipped with Sony's Acoustic Surface Audio Plus technology, which uses 2 actuators and 2 subwoofers to generate sound from the screen itself. Sound quality was very good as far as TV speakers go, delivering impressive bass, volume, tonal balance and dialogue clarity, with one highlight being the precise audio localization to different parts of the picture on screen. The QD OLED panel on the Sony A95K is reinforced to a thicker degree than that of the Samsung S95B, partly to accommodate the additional heat dissipation layer, but hopefully this will also mean that the A95K would suffer from unwanted flexing and bending issues which affected some S95B units. The supplied premium remote control has been revamped from the previous version to include fewer buttons. And until I experienced it, it would never have crossed my mind that a shorter length could actually feel better to hold in the hand. As someone who frequently tests TVs in the dark, I appreciated the remote's backlit function, which is triggered by motion and light sensors, so the keys will be illuminated automatically when you pick up the remote, but only in a dark room. Sony has bundled a Bravia Cam video camera accessory with every A95K sold, which can be used for gesture control and video calls. Because the focus of this channel is on in-depth picture quality analysis, we did not manage to find time to test out the Bravia Cam feature. To sum up, thanks largely to its QD OLED panel, the Sony A95K represents a worthwhile upgrade over last year's A90J, which had previously won our 2021 TV shootout, delivering improved near-black stability, cleaner screen uniformity that's free of color tinting off-axis, as well as higher peak brightness and color luminance, which contributes to a more impactful HDR presentation. Our A95K review sample is not as accurate as LG and Panasonic OLEDs in near-black luminance tracking, while the TV also lags behind LG and Samsung OLEDs slightly for next-gen HDMI 2.1 gaming. However, when you take into account its class-leading motion and gradation, not to mention eradication of unnecessary auto-dimming shenanigans without requiring service menu access, we think that in terms of overall picture quality, the Sony A95K is the TV to beat in 2022, and so it earns our highly recommended Best in Class award. Now, I haven't touched upon the Android Smart TV interface on the Bravia A95K in this video, but just like on all Sony Android TVs, the user experience can get clunky and less responsive over time. I've done a video demonstrating 11 little known hacks to speed up your Sony Android TV performance, so go watch my instruction video by clicking here.